On September the 19th, 2008, a horrific tragedy unfolded in the blue-tinted waters of Jackson Blue Springs. Richard Mork, a passionate and safety-conscious diver, ventured into the serene waters of the spring on a warm Florida afternoon. Everything appeared to be progressing smoothly during the dive when tragedy struck at a staggering depth of 2,000 feet, turning the once peaceful dive into an unimaginable nightmare. This is the Jackson Blue Springs disaster of 2008. Jackson Blue Spring is a shore-accessible freshwater dive site located at 5461 Blue Springs Highway in Marianna, Florida. The spring is called Blue Spring by the locals and Jackson Blue by cave divers. Located approximately 5 miles east of Marianna, at the northeastern end of Merritt's Mill Pond, Jackson Blue Spring holds a significant role as the primary spring responsible for feeding the pond. Along the 4.25-mile stretch from Jackson Spring to the current dam, there are a total of 7 other springs. However, the ones that are most known to people, especially divers, include Twin and Hole-in-the-Wall caves. These 2 springs are frequently visited due to their accessibility. Jackson Blue Spring is a remarkable natural wonder, known for its unique features and impressive discharge of groundwater. The spring pool itself has an interesting shape, with a diameter of approximately 240 feet from southwest to northeast and 233 feet from northwest to southeast. Its maximum depth reaches between 81 to 90 feet, or 25 to 27 meters. On the southern shore of the spring pool, you'll find a lowland cypress gum forest, creating a picturesque scene. Meanwhile, the northern half of the pool is bordered by high ground that slopes upward to nearly 20 feet above the water level, offering a stunning view of the surroundings. One of the most captivating aspects of Blue Spring is its consistent water temperature, which stays at a pleasant 68 degrees year-round, which makes it a popular destination for visitors throughout the year. The pool is a first magnitude spring, which means it discharges more than 64 million gallons a day, which is enough to keep that entire Merritt's Mill Pond filled with crystal clear water. The water discharge from Blue Spring is believed to have been underground for about 17 years. Therefore, the chemical composition of the water is a result of rainfalls and seepage from that time period. The spring's stunning white limestone cave system beneath its waters offers an alluring opportunity for divers. It is normally a fairly high flow system, which limits penetration unless you're using a scooter. Open water scuba diving and cave diving at Jackson Blue Spring and other springs in the Merritt's Mill Pond area are allowed, given proper permits from the county. The cave system is relatively easy to navigate. It is straightforward in terms of its layout and structure. The map of the cave system shows a main passageway that can be followed. This main passageway is the primary route through the cave. However, the map doesn't indicate the existence of numerous smaller paths within the cave system. These smaller paths might have been forgotten over time, which may indicate the reason these paths are not prominently shown on the map. Consequently, some of these smaller paths may already have a line laid. This can sometimes give inexperienced divers the impression that these paths are open for exploration. Dive experts, on the other hand, advise against venturing into these smaller restrictions. The reason is that there is usually nothing significant to see in these paths, and it's not worth taking the risk. Born in December 1969, Richard Mork was a person who radiated an infinite amount of energy throughout his life. From his earliest days to adulthood, he was known for his unwavering passion and zest for life, leaving a lasting impact on all who knew him. Richard's optimistic outlook, coupled with his ability to face challenges with a smile, was truly inspiring. Above all, his love for his children knew no bounds, and he cherished every moment he spent with them. Living on the west side of Houston, Richard possessed an insatiable love for adventure, travel, and exploring new horizons. He was not only an avid skier, but also a passionate scuba diver. It wasn't until 2005, during a work trip to Doha, Qatar, that he discovered his deep fascination for cave diving. Driven by his newfound passion, Richard wasted no time and underwent comprehensive PADI cavern certification while in Doha, solidifying his skills and knowledge as a diver. During his stay in Doha, Richard seized the opportunity to embark on a scuba trip to Oman, accompanied by 2 colleagues. Their weekend escapade took them to breathtaking dive sites in the southern regions of Qatar. After forging unforgettable memories in Qatar, Richard eventually returned to his home in Houston following 9 eventful months, where his newfound passion continued to grow. His schedule consisted of diving every other weekend. In addition to his physical diving expeditions, Richard actively engaged with various dive forums and clubs, seeking to connect with fellow diving enthusiasts and expand his knowledge. Under the name Packet Sniffer, Richard created his first post on Scuba Board on July the 14th, 2005, upon his return. "I have just entered this great sport. I can't believe that I haven't done this earlier. Anyway, I live on the west side of Houston. I just certified for OW in May and have done some dives in Qatar and Oman. I travel a bit in my profession. I just returned from Qatar after being there 9 months, which is where I was certified. So, I'm getting back into the swing of things and am looking for responsible dive buddies. I'm easy to get along with and really enjoy any adventure." From these small glimpses into Richard's private life, it becomes apparent that he possessed a friendly and outgoing nature, as well as an appetite for adventure. On November the 29th, 2005, Richard became a member of a local diving group called Chum Social Dive Group. City of Houston Underwater Mariners, or CHUM, is a Houston scuba club which was founded by a group of divers from all levels of certification and experience to promote diving in Texas and share their experiences from around the world. Little did Richard know at the time, but his decision to become a member of CHUM Social Dive Club would serve as the catalyst for a significant relationship with Dan Wyant, another local diver. Richard and Dan would soon form a deep bond, becoming trusted dive buddies. Fast forward 3 years later, and by now Richard and Dan had extensively explored various caves in Florida, including Eagle's Nest, deep holes in Wakulla County, and caves in Mariana and its surrounding areas. Now, 2008, Richard and Dan had made 2 previous dive trips together in northern Florida in the past year. By this point, they had around 15 dives together as buddies in Florida caves. Richard was the only cave diver Dan had been with who exclusively used a rebreather for his diving equipment. The Megalodon is a fully closed-circuit rebreather manufactured by Innerspace Systems Corp. And Richard's choice of equipment. Unlike traditional scuba gear, a fully closed-circuit rebreather does not release gas into the water with each breath, but rather the exhaled gas flows through an absorbent canister where the carbon dioxide is removed. Also, unlike open-circuit scuba equipment, a rebreather normally has 2 gas bottles. One contains pure oxygen, the other contains dilutant, either air or a mixture of helium and oxygen. When a diver breathes on the rebreather, his or her exhaled breath has its carbon dioxide absorbed by a mechanism called the scrubber canister. Oxygen sensors measure the oxygen partial pressure in the gas leaving the canister. The rebreather control electronics and firmware operate a solenoid-controlled oxygen add valve to raise the oxygen concentration back to the desired value, to make up for the oxygen that is metabolized by the diver. According to the US Navy Dive Manual, a hypoxic condition occurs at an oxygen concentration level between 0.16 atmospheres absolute and hyperoxic condition at a level above 1.5 atmospheres absolute. Both conditions can lead to unconsciousness and death. Atmospheres absolute is an essential factor for divers to consider when planning their dives. It helps them determine maximum depth levels, calculate oxygen requirements, and plan safe ascent rates in order to avoid decompression sickness. With this knowledge, divers can be confident that they are diving safely and responsibly. Most rebreathers are designed to maintain oxygen concentration between 0.75 and 1.3 atmospheres absolute. The Megalodon is normally equipped with 2 visual displays that allow the diver to monitor the oxygen concentration, battery life, and gas cylinder pressures. There is also a heads-up display that provides a visual alert, prompting the diver to check the detailed data on his primary and secondary displays. In the event of failure of the electronic-controlled oxygen add valve, the diver would be able to manually add oxygen while monitoring his primary and secondary displays. On Thursday, September the 18th, Dan left Georgetown, Texas for Marianna, Florida around noon. At approximately 3 p.m., he arrived in Houston at the apartment of Richard's friend. Richard was staying with his friend because of Hurricane Ike. During the trip to Marianna, Richard and Dan discussed dive planning for the dives they wanted to do on the trip. They proceeded from Houston to Marianna, Florida, arriving at Cape Adventurer's rental trailer at approximately 1:45 a.m. on September the 19th. The pair rewoke at around 9 a.m. on the same day after getting a few hours of sleep. Richard had fruit and a bowl of instant oatmeal for breakfast. Richard and Dan then drove to the Marianna Winn-Dixie to get lunch supplies. The original plan was to dive hole-in-the-wall cave using one of Ed Sorensen's rental boats. However, when they got to Cave Adventurers, they found that all of his boats were rented, a mistake that was their fault as they had both forgotten to call and reserve a boat. So in turn, they decided to push off their hole-in-the-wall dive until Sunday, and instead spend the day doing a couple of dives in Jackson Blue, a site they had both dived together before. From Ed's shop, they headed to the sheriff's office to sign in at approximately 10 a.m., before arriving at Jackson Blue at approximately 10:15 a.m. After arrival, Dan and Richard began to put their gear together and discuss their dive plan. It was agreed that Dan would dive a back mount configuration with a 6 cubic feet argon bottle, along with 2 80 cubic feet aluminium tanks and a 40 cubic feet aluminium tank filled with gas mixture containing 32% oxygen. In cave diving, back mount refers to a specific positioning of diving equipment where the diver's primary cylinders or tanks are mounted on their back. Richard would use his MEG rebreather along with his normal rebreather tanks. In addition, Richard equipped himself with 2 80 cubic feet aluminium bailout bottles. These stages contain a gas mixture with 32% oxygen. Richard will also have another 40 cubic feet aluminium cylinder as a stage bottle. This stage cylinder also contains a gas mixture with 32% oxygen. The dive plan was for the pair to scooter to about 3,300 feet. Dan was using a long-body Gavin, while Richard used an X-scooter. Richard had recently done some work on his X-scooter, so he said he was not comfortable scootering past 3,300 feet. Richard would drop one of his 80 cubic feet aluminium bottles at the back of the trash room to be used for bailout safety use on dives later on Friday and Saturday. After they dropped the scooters, the plan was to swim to approximately 3,900 feet and then make the jump over to Deloish's Delight, continuing until they hit 1/3 or completed the circuit. As Dan was preparing his gear for the dive, he observed Richard prepping his MEG rebreather for the dive. He watched him analyze and label each of his tanks. Although he did not observe him packing his scrubber canister, his belief is he was using a radial canister. Richard had told Dan on the drive over that his oxygen sensors were 18 months old, but he believed they were still operating within acceptable parameters. Regular maintenance and sensor replacement are crucial to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the oxygen monitoring system in the rebreather. The frequency of changing oxygen sensors in a rebreather can vary depending on the manufacturer's recommendations, the type of sensor used, and the specific model of the rebreather. However, as a general guideline, oxygen sensors in a rebreather typically need to be replaced every 12 months. They geared up and entered the water at approximately 12:45 p.m. Dan initially had an issue with bubbles that was discovered during their air drills. Thankfully, Richard was able to help him correct the issue without Dan having to leave the water. Dan observed Richard pre-breathing his rebreather loop, and to the best of his somewhat limited knowledge of rebreathers, Richard performed all of his normal pre-dive checks as he had seen on previous dives with him. At 1:04 p.m, they began their dive, Richard leading and Dan following. Both Richard and Dan deployed their oxygen bottles in about 30 feet of water, just inside the entrance. They made it about 100 feet into the cave when it became obvious that Richard was not happy with the performance of his scooter. He made several adjustments to it, but after approximately 3 to 4 minutes, he asked Dan, through hand signals, if he wanted to park the scooters and swim. Dan agreed, so they both turned the pitches down on their scooters and attached them to the beginning of the gold line. At 10 minutes into the dive, they descended down the chimney to a depth of approximately 90 feet. At approximately 900 feet penetration, Dan reached halves and 200 psi on his first stage bottle, so he shut it down and dropped it on the main line. At the first tee, they proceeded to the right. At approximately 1,500 feet, Richard reached halves and 200 psi on his second stage, so he shut it down and dropped it on the main line. Unbeknownst to Richard, there were at least 2 faults with his rebreather that went unnoticed during his preparation for the dive. Firstly, the rebreather's age caused inaccurate oxygen sensor readings. Secondly, there was an issue with the improper assembly of the solenoid-controlled oxygen add valve. The initial fault caused the rebreather's displays to inaccurately report lower oxygen levels than the actual levels when the oxygen concentration rose above approximately 1.0 atmospheres absolute. As for the second fault, it completely prevented the rebreather from functioning automatically during the entire dive. The solenoid valve was not free-flowing oxygen throughout the approximate hour-long dive. Since the solenoid control valve failed in the open position due to its improper assembly, the oxygen supply to the valve would have had to be turned off, most likely via the oxygen isolation valve that is located on the chest-mounted counterlung. In this setup, Richard would need to manually add oxygen using the add valve, which is also positioned on the counterlung. By bypassing the solenoid valve, Richard took on the responsibility of regulating oxygen concentration. To accomplish this, he must vigilantly monitor the oxygen levels through both the heads-up display and either the primary or secondary handset displays. This attentiveness is essential to prevent the oxygen level from reaching either dangerously low or excessively high levels. This procedure is deemed acceptable in emergency situations, allowing a diver to abort a dive and achieve a safe recovery in the event of a solenoid valve failure. However, it is important to emphasize that using this technique as a regular practice to initiate or continue dives is not recommended or accepted. According to NEDU, the Department of Naval Experimental Diving Unit, the intentional closure of the oxygen isolation valve by Richard was likely done with the purpose of preventing gas from freely flowing through the non-functional solenoid-controlled add valve and entering the breathing loop. Given the positioning and functioning of the isolation valve, there was a potential risk that the oxygen concentration in the breathing loop would rapidly increase to a toxic level. This situation would pose a serious threat to Richard's safety. Richard and Dan reached the third tee at approximately 58 minutes. Richard made a left and headed down the rabbit hole. Dan began to follow Richard down the rabbit hole, but he stopped just inside the entrance. After Richard swam in place for about 5 seconds, Dan noticed a relatively large amount of bubbles from his head area. Richard continued to swim in place for another 5 seconds, and Dan flashed him with his primary light. Dan's intention was to get Richard to turn around, so he could suggest that they should take the other direction, around the tee. Almost immediately after Dan flashed Richard, he began to turn around. Belief was that he was acknowledging Dan's flashing, but by the time Richard got turned around, in at most 5 to 10 seconds, Dan could tell something wasn't right. Richard's light was flashing around, like he was holding it loosely, and his movements were jerky, not his normal, very fluid movements. Richard bolted past Dan towards the tee and the entrance. Dan immediately turned to follow and overtake Richard. After several seconds, and almost exactly 60 minutes into the dive, Richard stopped swimming. This was about 5 feet downstream from the third tee, and right on top of the gold line. Dan was on top of Richard in less than 5 seconds. When he reached him, he was jerking, and his loop was floating above his head. His loop had been in his mouth just seconds earlier when he swam past Dan. Dan immediately deployed the open circuit regulator from one of his 32% bailout bottles. He put the regulator in Richard's mouth, and when he did not immediately attempt to breathe off of it, Dan purged the regulator for him. For the next 15 minutes, Dan held the regulator in Richard's mouth, purging it at regular intervals in the hope that he was getting some gas, and at some point he would begin to breathe. At first, it seemed like he might have been trying to breathe, but that quickly subsided, and after that, he was completely unresponsive. After 15 minutes, Dan had to make the tough decision to leave Richard, as his own gas situation was becoming critical. On the exit, Dan had to stop himself at one point because he was overbreathing his regulators and could not get enough air. He was able to get his breathing back under control and got to the decompression stop without any further incident. Dan performed approximately 2 minutes of deco on oxygen and then did an ascent. On the surface, there was a group of divers on 2 pontoon boats geared up for a dive. Dan was able to get their attention and have them call 911. Dan forced himself to wait on the surface for about 2 minutes due to decompression sickness concerns. Then he exited, went to his car, and called Ed Sorensen. Dan briefed Ed on the situation, and as he was doing so, he walked up to the front of the park and opened the gate for the emergency personnel. Members of the Jackson County Sheriff's Office dive team and 2 other certified cave divers recovered the body of Richard from the cave Friday afternoon. The police worked on their reports, and Richard's gear was sent to NEDU for evaluation. Due to one of the oxygen sensors being incapable of accurately indicating oxygen concentrations above 1.0 atmospheres absolute, and the other 2 unable to indicate values above 1.5 atmospheres absolute, the readings on the HUD, primary and secondary displays would have underestimated the actual oxygen concentration present in the breathing loop. As per NEDU's findings, Richard died due to hyperoxia, and since the solenoid valve was not functioning properly, Richard manually added air to compensate for the perceived low oxygen levels. This resulted in an excessive buildup of oxygen in the rebreather, leading to hyperoxia and ultimately causing his death. Attempting to manually control the oxygen concentration with faulty sensors would have proven highly challenging. The risk of maintaining safe levels under such circumstances would have been daunting. Chum decided to rename their Diver of the Year award in honor of Richard. It is now the Richard Packet Sniffer Mork Diver of the Year award. There was a short memorial service in honor of Richard Mork on Saturday, January the 17th, at Jackson Blue at 2 p.m. At the conclusion of the service, his family and friends placed a small memorial plaque in Richard's honor in Jackson Blue. As family and friends bid farewell to Richard, they remembered the light he brought into their lives and the profound impact of his adventurous and loving soul. May he rest in peace. Cave diving is a trial enough when you do have the proper training and certification. When you do it without the certification, you may be chewing off way more than you can handle. It's like flying a plane without being trained to fly. Tragically, numerous divers have lost their lives in Jackson Blue Springs, and a common factor among these incidents is the lack of cave certification. Among those who faced trouble at Jackson Blue was Harry F. Melissa, who found himself stuck deep underwater while diving with a friend. Shockingly, Harry himself did not possess the cave certification required for such a perilous dive. This is the story of Harry and the Jackson Blue disaster of 2007. Harry F. Melissa, aged 48, was born in Lancaster, Ohio, in 1959, where he lived most of his life. However, for the past 5 years, he had been residing in Marianna, Florida. He was a devoted family man with a loving wife named Pat Melissa and 2 young daughters, Stephanie and Katrina Melissa. Professionally, Harry was the owner and operator of Air Services, a successful business that specialized in designing and building automotive paint booths. Beyond his work, Harry had a passion for diving. He had been a certified open water diver for over 2 decades. However, despite his experience, he never pursued the required certification for cave diving. Still, he frequently dove into caves, enjoying the wonders of places like Twin Caves and Hole in the Wall at Merritt's Mill Pond in Mariana. Cave certification is of utmost importance in cave diving, due to the distinct and demanding nature of cave environments. Unlike open water diving, where access to the surface is unrestricted, cave diving involves navigating through tight spaces, with limited visibility and potential hazards. This certification is crucial for the safety of divers, as it provides specialized training and knowledge to address the unique challenges posed by caves. On March 5, 2007, Harry Melissa, along with a friend of his, Gordon Smith, who only had a basic cave diving certification, set out for an afternoon of diving. Harry and Gordon geared up and checked each other's equipment, ready for their dive. Before they could enter the cave, they needed to swim across a shallow eel grass bed, thriving near the spring entrance. As they approached the cave, they could sense the water's flow becoming stronger. The cave released a remarkable 60 million gallons of water per day, making it similar to swimming against a swift river current. Harry took the lead and ventured inside. As they entered the cavern zone, they adjusted their buoyancy to navigate the smaller section where the flow gets really strong. The water was exceptionally clear, with no suspended particles rushing past, only the serene yet unwavering force of moving water. Once through the narrow entrance, they were still swimming upstream, although the flow was slightly less intense. Cave divers generally use a frog kick to minimize disturbing the bottom, but this kick is not as powerful as a normal flutter kick, so the pair progressed slowly. Despite the challenges, they pressed on in the cavern zone, with the entrance's light still visible. They encountered a fascinating little restriction, providing an excellent opportunity for practice and skill refinement. As Harry and Gordon swam, they eventually reached the stop sign marking the end of the cavern zone. Passing this sign, daylight vanished, and they knew they had entered the exclusive realm of cave divers. This sign served as a crucial reminder that cave diving requires proper training and equipment. Undeterred, the pair continued their journey beyond the stop sign, approaching a crack known as the chimney, where the cave descended deeper. The path wasn't entirely vertical, but it had a steep incline. The strong water flow seemed to be cautioning them to stay away, but in reality, this was the way into the cave. Following the main line, they descended further into the chimney. At the bottom, they encountered a narrow section that required some effort to navigate. Fortunately, it opened up into a larger, wider area with a weaker water flow, making their progress easier. Not too long after, they reached a pair of line arrows at a distance of about 600 feet. These arrows usually indicated the way out, but when 2 arrows were present, it signified a nearby side passage. Now exploring the side passage, Harry and Gordon delved into a section of the cave they had never seen before, making the experience truly thrilling. In an instant, just as their progress seemed to be going well, it turned into a nightmare. In cave diving, when you push your limits or experience level, you're essentially putting your life on the line. Harry had become stuck in a small opening in this side passage, and Gordon had no way of freeing him. In a panic, Gordon surfaced and called for help. Left alone and trapped 700 feet from the entrance, one could only imagine the overwhelming sense of panic circulating through Harry's mind. The comments on the case strongly suggest that Harry's lack of being cave certified influenced the way he reacted to the situation. There is a prevailing belief that had Harry been cave certified, he would never have found himself in a situation where he had got stuck. The sheriff's office and local cave diving expert, Ed Sorensen, responded within minutes. The sheriff's diving squad is not cave certified, So Ed Sorensen was tasked with the responsibility to search inside the spring cave for Harry. He was in the water 3 minutes later and used a motorized scooter to reach Melissa as quick as possible. Ed thought he was going to be able to rescue Melissa, but instead found evidence of a fatal panic. Ed was travelling through the crystal clear water of the main passage when he encountered a thick cloud of silt about 700 feet in. He took a side passage to the left and followed the silt to Melissa's body, which was 70 feet down the side passage and 96 feet underwater. Harry had taken off his diving gear, including his tank, which still had oxygen, which was concluded that he removed in a state of panic, and eventually died by drowning as he tried to swim out of the cave. The most time-consuming part of the process in recovering Harry's body was Ed's ascent after locating him, as Ed was required to pause for decompression before leaving the water. At this point in the cave's history, numerous divers from all over the county have tragically drowned, often due to the lack of cave certification. Approximately 8 to 12 people have lost their lives at this point, to be precise, and unfortunately, this would not be the last case. As we conclude this harrowing tale of cave exploration, it serves as a stark reminder of the significance of cave certification and the potential consequences of overlooking safety protocols. Cave certification is not just a formality, it's a lifeline. Proper training equips divers with the knowledge and techniques essential to navigate through the challenging cave environment safely. Harry's tragic mistake of diving without proper certification reflects the alarming reality that daring to venture into caves unprepared can have dire outcomes. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.